Hello and welcome back to Level Up Rugby. We have now understood and selected our equipment, our preferred kicking tee and our boots, which should be non-variable, always remaining the same from kick to kick. And then we have also taken a look at the final piece of equipment, the ball, which is variable but not within our direct control in games. So now let's continue onwards into phase 2 and discuss the aspects of our process that are variable but are also within our control. In today's video, we're going to be talking about ball setup and tee alignment, the very first variable but most certainly controllable aspect of our process. Firstly, let's begin with tee direction. Simply, the tee should match the ball. No matter what direction the ball is facing towards, as we'll be getting onto, the tee should match it, so it can support the ball properly in the way that it was designed to, preventing the ball from moving around and changing from your desired positioning before you come to strike it. Now, let's get into the hotly debated ball setup, starting with the ball's direction. There are again two common opinions on the best direction to have your ball facing. To either keep everything straight or to open the ball up and have it more or less pointing towards one of the two posts, depending on what foot you kick with. As always, let's start with my personal preference of keeping everything straight. Personally, I'm looking to strike in the most efficient and effective way. A straight line from point to point through my preferred sweet spot of the vertical axis. If I do this, then the ball will fly straight. So therefore it makes a great deal of sense to have the ball pointing down the middle of the post, because if the ball is pointing straight and I strike straight through the ball, then the ball will fly straight down the middle of the posts. Again, it's very simple. However, there is a slight downside to this method of strike and swing. I want to finish with my strike foot to target, 12 o'clock, but I'm already swinging down 12 o'clock to strike the point of the ball. So it's a slightly unnatural movement to force myself to stay square and prevent my natural swing from coming around to allow me to finish down 12. This presents two subsequent issues. The first issue that occurs, especially when fatigued, is if I swing loosely, then I will come from swinging down 12 to contact the point of the ball, but will then swing around to finish at 11 in a C shape, usually hooking the ball left. So, although efficient and effective to strike in this straight line through the ball, you must constantly, consciously be aware of not swinging loosely to prevent yourself from swinging around to 11 o'clock in that C shape and thus pulling your kick. The second issue is that when kicking the ball straight on, like this, because you have to force yourself to stay square and straight, you're not allowing yourself to swing naturally. Although still highly efficient and effective, it isn't optimal. Your body naturally wants to swing around to 11, but you are preventing yourself from doing that, forcing yourself to stay straight, finishing your swing a little earlier than is optimal to prevent it from coming around. Therefore missing out on a piece of extra swing runway and therefore foot speed and power. However, saying all this, although it may not be as much of a optimal, natural, relaxed swing, it is still just as, if not more, effective in sending the ball straight, if you have the ball placed straight on the tee, as you can imagine. If you have the ball placed straight on the tee and you force yourself to stay straight along the vertical axis line of the ball, striking from point to point of the ball will fly straight down the middle of the post. Maybe not as far, because you're preventing the full extension of your swing leg, but it will be consistently more accurate. The alternative method of ball placement that a lot of kickers find preferable is to open the ball up, turning it out to point towards one of the two uprights depending on what foot you kick with. Also leaning the ball slightly forwards on an upright kicking tee. Let's look into the reasoning for this that often gets overlooked and yet again simplified down to just having a sweeter strike on the ball. Often kickers say they do this because it opens up the sweet spot of the ball. But as we have covered in phase 1, we know that this isn't entirely true. Often just a simple way of overcoming the question because they don't particularly know why they do it. As we know, it actually only opens up a sweet spot on the ball that isn't even all that sweet of a spot, because the ball is only going to be pushing one half of itself away as opposed to its whole self, as we know from the sweetest sweet spot. Make sure you go and check that out if you haven't already. So to me, this reasoning doesn't really make all too much sense when doing this on an upright tee. I would still advise to keep everything straight and aim to hit through that horizontal axis of the ball. However, when it comes to a telescopic kicking tee, I can see some logic for why it would be optimal to turn the ball out towards one of the uprights. Just a quick little side note before we get into this. I will be covering this, what we're about to get into, in a lot more detail in phase 3 when we look specifically at our swing. Don't worry if it's a bit confusing and it's a bit complicated, because it is, but we will be covering it in a lot more detail. We just need to understand the very basics for now. Essentially, there are 3 ways to swing through the ball. Down 12 and around to 11, commonly known as a C shape, that we previously just discussed as being a loose swing. Down and through to 12, that we also just covered as being my personal preference. Or down 1 and around to 12, an adaptation of the C shape that we're going to get into now, that should be people's reasoning for turning the ball out to the side to face an upright. Not that it's the sweetest strike, but it allows you to swing down to 1 o'clock and around to 12 in this fashion. Like I said, to cover it briefly, a C shape has too heavy a reliance on timing and doesn't have an effective pillar momentum energy transfer, so it's not efficient, nor effective, nor optimal. Down and to 12, as we just covered to begin with the straight ball alignment, is a slightly unnatural swing that means you have to force yourself to stay square to target. So although efficient and effective, it is not optimal, like we just covered. But when swinging down 1, you are swinging naturally, just like a C shape, apart from now that C shape starts at 1 o'clock and ends to target in a J shape. As always, to use an analogy to explain the adaptation of this C shape, it is the difference between a hit pass and a push pass in hockey. When swinging in that C shape, you are relying on your timing to send the ball straight. You are swinging around in an arc and hoping to make contact with the ball at the point of your swing that will send the ball forwards. Not only is there this heavy reliance on timing, but also, as we have said, this method does not have an effective pillar momentum energy transfer in goal kicking, but more on that in phase 3. On the other hand, when you swing down 1 o'clock, this is more like a push pass in hockey. You are utilizing the time you have in contact with the ball as your foot travels into the ball, as we discussed in a sweet strike, to catch and drag the ball around to target, like a push pass in hockey. It is an incredibly difficult skill to catch and drag a rugby ball like this, especially when striking through the vertical axis, but it is the most optimal way of striking the ball because it allows you to swing in the most natural way that your body wants you to, allowing yourself to reach that full extension, giving you more runway to accelerate through the ball. But please understand, we're going over this very briefly. It is quite complicated, so if you don't understand, that's okay, we'll get onto it another time. So swinging down 1, striking the inside panel of the ball and dragging it around to 12 is all good when the ball is sat upright on the tee, because you have the whole panel of the ball to work around. However, when kicking on a telescopic kicking tee, if you swing down 1 o'clock, you're going to contact the same inner panel of the ball, but this time around the vertical axis and the point of the ball, which creates an issue that I call a spaceship ball flight. To eradicate this undesirable spaceship ball flight, you can either resort back to the alternative, slightly less optimal, but easier and therefore more consistently achievable method of swinging down to 12 that we discussed at the beginning that I opt for, which is still incredibly effective in sending the ball straight. Or you can turn the ball out to face the left or right hand upright. This will allow you to swing down 1 o'clock and drag the ball around to have it facing 12 o'clock by the time you finish your swing and lose contact with the ball, just like the push pass in hockey. However, I must say this is an incredibly difficult skill to accomplish, especially in the reduced time before the ball reacts and refines its natural shape due to the increased pressure around the point of the ball that we discussed in the sweet spot when we talked about the trumpet and the trampoline analogy. So although turning the ball out like this on a telescopic kicking tee may be superior with regard to performance, providing the means to perform the optimal swing through the vertical axis, it sort of defeats the whole reason why we chose the vertical axis to strike through in the first place. The vertical axis is meant to be a lot easier to achieve a sweeter strike with, but when looking to strike in this difficult drag fashion, the chances of you achieving that sweet strike and sending the ball straight decrease massively, to the point where you may as well resort back to kicking through the horizontal axis in this drag fashion. Kicking through the horizontal axis will be just as optimal as striking in this drag fashion through the vertical axis, and is just as difficult, so you may as well stick with that. What I'm trying to say is that the benefit of the vertical axis is its simplicity to achieve an efficient and effective strike, sending the ball straight. However, turning the ball out to face one of the uprights completely removes this benefit, because it's no longer a simple task to send the ball straight. As I have said in the past, any skill is acquirable, but some are more difficult and are therefore much harder to achieve consistently with accuracy. The rewards of turning the ball out like this are not a lot higher than keeping everything straight. However, the risk, due to the difficulty of dragging the ball, makes the probability of achieving the optimal swing and strike very low, especially in comparison with the easy, low risk, but still efficient and effective method of keeping everything straight. So in my opinion, just like striking through the horizontal axis, although turning the ball out as long as you're swinging down 1 o'clock and dragging the ball around to 12 is more optimal, you will reap greater rewards on average if you keep everything straight. Another important hindrance to mention that makes achieving consistency all the more difficult with your ball placement when turning the ball out is the question of, by how much are you turning the ball out? The general response that I've been saying throughout this video is to turn the ball out to either the right or left hand upright. But the first issue of inconsistency with that method is when you go from a kick at goal from in front of the posts to a kick at goal from the sideline. As you can imagine, the ball will now be turned out different amounts depending on where you are on the field. If you're in front of the post, the ball gets turned out a lot more than if you're on the sideline because the angle is a lot narrower. If I was to recommend an angle to have the ball turned out to, it would be 1 o'clock. As you can imagine, it enables me to catch and drag the ball, but even still, this is still a guesstimation, which leaves you wide open to inconsistency. Realistically, when turning the ball out, you're more or less guessing what angle to turn it to, which will inevitably lead to that undesired inconsistency. Again, in comparison, due to its simplicity, keeping the ball down the middle and everything straight is a lot easier and therefore will bring you more consistency with your ball placement, the one variable that is easiest to control in your process. So, in my opinion, keeping everything straight is the best way to set your ball up on the tee. Although slightly less optimal with regard to energy transfer because you're forcing your swing to come to a halt a little bit earlier to stay straight, it does allow you to strike the ball straighter more easily. Because your target is now the ball, everything is so much simpler. Lining your ball up on the tee can be done so much simpler because you're just pointing it down the middle of the post. Wherever you are on the field, down the middle is down the middle. You don't have to guess where that ball's direction is going. It's always going to be down the middle of those posts. And then once the ball is on the tee, you have the simple task of kicking from point to point. Of course, it's easier said than done, but at least you have an understanding of it. In my opinion, simplicity breeds consistency. The simpler the skill is, the more easily it can be done consistently. So therefore, keeping everything straight is the best way for you to put the ball on the tee because the ball will always be the same on that tee. It's such a simple task to point the ball down the middle of the post. It's so easy. Just line it up. And then once the ball is lined up, striking through in a straight line is an easy task as well. Yes, you have to try and force yourself to stay square. You have to constantly be consciously aware of striking in that straight fashion, not loosely. But once you can do that, it's just an easy piece of cake. So keep everything straight. The other important variable that you can and need to control and maintain consistency with in your ball setup is the tilt of the ball. It is commonly thought and taught that in windy conditions, you should tilt the ball forwards to drive it low and avoid the breeze, laying the ball flatter on the tee. But again, as always, little explanation comes after this statement to explain why this is and what is actually occurring to achieve this low ball trajectory. Let's first draw from our knowledge of a sweep strike. To achieve a sweep strike through the vertical axis, you must look to strike the ball from point to point. This will create the optimal pushback from the ball, pushing its whole self away in the direction of the posts. So, as you kick along this line with the ball now lying flatter, as you can imagine, the ball will drive lower to the ground with more forward momentum and punch to create that lower ball trajectory. So that's why you lie the ball flatter in windy conditions. But how does this knowledge actually help us decide the optimal angle to tilt our ball at on the tee in normal conditions? Well, continuing this line of thought along, applying it to how we have the ball tilted and positioned on the tee for any standard kick, of course, we still want to have that same punch and a sweet strike on the ball. The only difference this time is that we want to have more loft on the ball to balance out with the drive, to send the ball further. So how can we manipulate and utilize the tilt and positioning of the ball to achieve this greater loft? Well, let's resort back to another piece of knowledge that we obtained in part 3 of tee selection, when we looked at the javelin thrower analogy. The optimal angle of release of a javelin is 45 degrees because this is the perfect balance of loft and drive and height and length that will result in the javelin traveling the furthest. So, to combine these two pieces of knowledge, we still want to have an efficient and effective strike on the ball, which means kicking from point to point so the ball pushes its whole self away. And we want the ball to have the most optimal flight path, which means taking off at 45 degrees. So the only way that we can accommodate both of these factors is to tilt the ball back at 45 degrees. So, in my opinion, the optimal angle to have the ball tilted back at when kicking off our preferred telescopic kicking tee is 45 degrees. Any higher than this, and you will either only push one half of the ball away and therefore not achieve a sweet strike, or if you're still looking to have this sweet strike on the ball, then the ball will have more height than length and thus not travel as far. Any lower than 45 degrees and the opposite will occur, with still the same negative consequences, as we discussed in the beginning of the video when explaining how to avoid a strong breeze. The ball trying to have more drive and length to travel lower to the ground and bypass the wind. But its strength in windy conditions actually proves to be its downfall in regular conditions because of its lack of loft, returning to the ground earlier, thus not travelling as far. So therefore, having the ball pointing straight towards target, tilted back up at 45 degrees on your telescopic kicking tee, and then having an efficient and effective sweet strike on the ball, kicking from point to point, swinging down and to 12 o'clock, will not only send the ball straight, but also at the optimal trajectory. Goal kicking is that simple. A lot of the time you'll still see kickers tilt the ball back to have it sat more upright on a telescopic kicking tee, and just to be clear, I am not saying that this is wrong. Like I always do say, comfort is key. So if this is comfortable for you, stick with it for now. Having the ball tilted more upright like this will allow you to generate that desired backspin on the ball more easily. So although it is not as effective in maximizing the potential power source of the ball, this doesn't mean that it's not effective altogether. You will actually be able to send the ball straighter more easily through this method. Make sure you check out this video for that reason. However, the more upright you tilt the ball on the tee, unless you're looking to strike through that horizontal axis, if you're contacting the bottom of the ball, your strike will not be as sweet. You will not be maximizing the full potential energy of the ball because, as we have discussed, the ball will only be pushing one half of itself away. So although you may be able to send the ball straighter more easily and get your rhythm back, as we discussed in this video, it's not as effective or optimal in sending the ball as far. Of course, you don't have to strike exactly through either the horizontal or the vertical axis every time you kick the ball, but the closer you can get to either one of these two sweet spots, then the sweeter your strike will be. So just keep that in mind before you decide to massively tilt the ball back on your telescopic kicking tee. So to conclude, I believe that keeping everything straight with the ball tilted back up at 45 degrees on a telescopic kicking tee is the best and most reliable method of ball placement. I believe this because simplicity breeds consistency. Like I've said countless times now, any skill is achievable. Some are easy and some are more difficult, but with time and practice, any can be acquired. However, skills that are simpler are much easier to master with consistency and accuracy. Striking through the horizontal axis or swinging down 1 o'clock in a drag fashion may be more optimal with regard to one-off performance, But because of their difficulty to reach this maximum performance potential, you are often consistently left with a result a lot lower than an alternative, simpler method of keeping everything straight or striking down 12 o'clock on average. So you can take confidence from the fact that, one, every time you put that ball on the tee, it will be consistently a lot closer to the exact same positioning every single time. Because lining the ball up down the middle of the post is so simple, no matter where you are on the field, as opposed to just guesstimating where 1 o'clock is, where you either have inconsistency from guessing this positioning or inconsistency from aiming at a particular post from different places on the field. And then two, keeping everything straight with the ball tilted back up at 45 degrees also provides the platform for such an effective and consistently achievable method of strike two, because to swing and strike down and to 12 o'clock is so much easier and simpler than swinging down 1 o'clock and dragging the ball to 12 o'clock in a C shape. And yet it's still so effective as well. If you kick the ball in an efficient and effective straight line from point to point, and the ball is positioned down the middle of the posts, tilted back up at 45 degrees on a telescopic kicking tee, then the ball will fly straight and it will fly at the optimum trajectory. It may not have the highest potential for distance due to the limiting factors of your 12 o'clock swing that we discussed earlier on, but it will fly consistently straighter and further on average. And that's the type of goal kicker we are trying to transform you into here at Level Up Rugby. One that is more consistently accurate from more places on the field. Maybe from not as many places as kicking with the optimal form, but who particularly cares about how far you can kick the ball if it doesn't go between the posts? Kicking with the optimal form may provide you with more distance, but I can guarantee you kicking in this efficient and effective way will still provide you with the distance that you need to be a competitive goal kicker. The difference is that when you kick efficiently and effectively in this manner, you'll be able to kick more consistently and more accurately from more places on the field. Hello and welcome back to Level Up Rugby. Today we're going to be concluding the discussion around ball setup with the final variable of the positioning of the seams and the valve. Throughout this and the next few videos preceding the strike zone in phase 3, you will continue to see the repetitive theme of superstition and the performance enhancing effects that it does not have. Kicking off this theme, we have the alignment of the seams and the positioning of the valve. Giving this conversation the length of time it probably deserves, there are negligible performance enhancing or even altering benefits or even effects to be had from the alignment of your seams and the positioning of the valve. As you progress higher and higher through the ranks of rugby or any professional sport for that matter, you begin to hear a lot of coaches talking about the 1 or 2 percenters.
Because all we're looking for here is like literally 2 or 3% improvement. That's all we need. But those 2 or 3% for the top players is the hard part to get. And it's just thinking about the player where you can get a bit more out of him.
With regard to the seams and the valve's respective positioning and placement, we are talking about 0.01 percenters. We're not talking about aerospace engineering levels of detail here. This literally is not rocket science. As detailed as goal kicking is and can be, no one is at the stage where a 0.01 degree of accuracy is going to have any significant enough of an effect on the flight of the ball or your performance in general that you should spend any significant amount of time thinking about. Following the 80-20 principle, you are much better off focusing on any other component of your process. You will reap much greater reward from doing that than you will do unnecessarily over worrying about how the seams and the valve are positioned on your ball and how they may be affecting your kick. As discussed in previous videos, the type of ball that you kick will have somewhat of an effect on its flight, but having the seams of that ball rolled in or out, or having the valve pointing in a certain direction, has more of an effect on you mentally than it does the ball physically. It is simply just superstition. If you are actually relying on the seams and the valve to help you guide the ball's flight through the posts, you aren't in true control of the ball or your kick. However, all of that being said, although negligible performance enhancing benefits come from the positioning of the seams and the valve, they can still be made use of. The seams in particular can be a useful tool to aid in your visualization, as we have covered in part 1 of positioning and placement, and we will again cover in the episode on visualization itself, coming later in phase 2, which can help you kick more accurately and more consistently, not any further or with a particular ball flight, just more consistently and more accurately. As you can imagine, and I'm sure you have heard countless times now, by lining the seams up down the middle of the posts, it helps you to better visualize the line through the ball that you wish to strike along, which doesn't guarantee that you will strike in that way that you desire, but does definitely mentally aid you in making it happen. So although having the seams positioned in a certain manner may not actually enhance or even alter the performance of the flight of your ball, it may help you mentally in achieving accuracy more consistently. Personally, in my own process, once I have positioned the ball and the seams down the middle of the posts, as I have previously explained, the ball has now become my target. There is actually realistically no longer a need for me to look up at the posts. Once I know that ball is positioned straight, all I have to do and know is the line through the ball that I'm going to strike along. For if it is pointing towards the target and I strike along that line, then the ball will go towards where it is pointing. So now, utilizing the ball and the seams positioning, my focus is purely on the ball, which can go a long way to help you improve your accuracy and consistency for all the aforementioned reasons. It may not actually allow you to kick further or have control of the flight path of the ball, but it definitely will go a long way for your accuracy and your consistency. Also, applying another philosophical approach to our ball, seam and valve positioning, and more generally our kicking process as a whole, the idea that how you do something is how you do everything can really aid us build and layer consistency into our kicking. Without diving in too deep, I simply mean that if you want to become more consistent overall, then you need to be more consistent in every aspect of your process. Although, as I have said enough times now, no performance enhancing benefits will come as a result of having the seams or the valve positioned in a certain direction. By simply having them positioned in the same direction, every time you put the ball on the tee, you are beginning to layer consistency into every single stage of your process, making the overall outcome more consistent. How consistently you do that something, whether it be the positioning of your ball or the boots that you wear or the tee that you choose, no matter how small and insignificant it may seem, is setting you on the right path for how consistently you do everything as a whole, achieving your desired outcome, the ball not going between the posts just once, but consistently over and over again. It is creating a mindset with an attention for the details, and thus creating consistency into the entirety of your process. Those small degrees of accuracy or inaccuracy and variance all add up over the course of time, and they are so easy to control, so just get them right. And that is the overriding conclusion of this first part of phase 2 on ball placement and positioning. At the end of the day, you can tilt the ball up at whatever angle that you wish, or you can turn it out to whatever direction you feel is most comfortable for whatever reason you may believe is beneficial. You can even have the seams rolled in or out, or the valve pointing in a certain direction, if you think that will help you for whatever superstitious reason that you have come up with. The only thing that I will tell you to do outright is whatever you pick, be consistent with it. Everything that we've discussed in phase 1 and so far in phase 2, and will continue to discuss until we reach phase 3, are simple controllables. These are all aspects of your process that do not require any skill to get right. There is literally no skillful element to doing it. No time pressure, nothing. But that often makes these the small things that are so often overlooked and rushed, and thus gotten wrong, leading to the overall outcome not being what you desire. The better you can control the small controllables, as I have said, layering consistency into every stage of your process, whether it be with your tee, boots or ball positioning, as we have covered so far, the more controllable and therefore accurate and consistent your final outcome will be as a whole overall.